The Hartrow Orphanage for Displaced Youth closed its doors on November 17, 1974, under circumstances that remain officially unexplained. The building still stands on the outskirts of Ashford County, a deteriorating monument of red brick and shattered windows, surrounded by a forest that has slowly reclaimed the grounds. No historical society preserves it. No urban explorers document it. The locals won't speak its name after sunset. What happened to the 43 children who vanished from Hartrow between 1971 and 1974 has never been solved. What the surviving staff witnessed has never been publicly acknowledged. This is their story, pieced together from documents that were never meant to be found. The orphanage opened in 1923, established by the Hartrow Foundation as a refuge for children orphaned by the influenza epidemic. For nearly 50 years, it operated without incident, a stern but functional institution where unwanted children waited for families that rarely came. The architecture was typical of its era. Long corridors with high ceilings, dormitories that slept 20, a chapel with stained glass windows depicting angels with too many eyes. Sister Margaret Hollis served as headmistress for 27 years. Her journals, discovered in a safety deposit box after her death in 1989, provide the earliest documentation of what she called the changing. Her handwriting in the initial entries is precise, almost mechanical. By the final pages, the letters slant and tremble, sometimes breaking through the paper entirely. The first entry of concern is dated March 3, 1971. Timothy Marsh, age 7, presented with unusual symptoms during morning inspection. The child's skin appeared oddly luminous in the chapel light, almost translucent at the fingertips. I attributed this to poor circulation or anemia. Nurse Pritchard examined him and found no fever, no rash, no obvious signs of illness. His appetite was normal. His behavior unchanged. But when he held his hands up to the window, I could see the shadow of bones beneath the skin, clear as an X-ray photograph. I have requested a doctor's visit, though the foundation has been slow to approve medical expenses. 4 days later, another entry. Timothy's condition has progressed. The translucence has spread from his hands to his forearms. Under certain lights, he appears almost to glow from within, as though he has swallowed the sun. The other children have begun to avoid him. They say he feels cold to the touch, that looking at him too long makes their eyes hurt. He seems unaware of his condition. When I asked if he felt unwell, he smiled and said he felt wonderful, that he could finally see clearly. I don't know what he meant. Dr. Ashworth is scheduled to visit tomorrow. But Dr. Ashworth never came. According to hospital records, he suffered a heart attack the night before his scheduled visit and died 3 days later. He was 41 years old, with no history of cardiac problems. The entries continue with increasing urgency. Timothy has become nearly transparent. In dim light, he is barely visible at all. The effect is most pronounced in his chest, where one can see the rhythmic pulsing of his heart, the inflation of his lungs, the architecture of his rib cage. It is beautiful and terrible. The other children refuse to sleep in the same dormitory. Even the staff members cross themselves when he passes. Father Doherty attempted an exorcism yesterday, but Timothy only laughed. His voice has taken on a hollow quality, like sound echoing in an empty room. He no longer eats, though he claims to feel no hunger. He spends hours staring at his own reflection in the windows. Sister Margaret's description of Timothy's appearance becomes almost poetic in its horror. She writes of how his eyes remained solid and dark while the rest of him faded, 2 black stones floating in an outline of a boy. She describes the sound he made when he moved, a faint chiming like glass touching glass. She notes that mirrors would not hold his reflection properly, that he appeared in them only as a shimmer, a distortion in the silver. The final entry regarding Timothy Marsh is dated March 29, 1971. Timothy is gone. I entered the dormitory this morning to find his bed empty, the sheets undisturbed. The window was closed and locked from the inside. There are no footprints in the dust. The other boys claim he simply faded during the night, becoming thinner and thinner until he was only an outline, then nothing at all. Young David Keller insists he heard Timothy speaking in his sleep, reciting something in a language he didn't recognize. When I asked what happened to Timothy's voice at the end, David began to cry. He said the voice didn't stop. He said it's still there, in the empty space where Timothy used to be, whispering things that make him want to forget his own name. We searched the grounds for 3 days. The police found nothing. The foundation has instructed me to record Timothy as a runaway, but I know he didn't run. Something took him. Or something made him into something else. When I walk past his empty bed, the air feels different there. Thicker. Colder. When I'm brave enough to reach out my hand, I can almost feel a shape, cold and smooth as glass. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I hear that chiming sound drifting through the halls. The disappearance of Timothy Marsh should have been enough to close Hartrow immediately. It wasn't. The foundation had influential friends and post-war orphanages were overcrowded. Questions were asked but not pursued. The official record states that Timothy Marsh was adopted by a family in Pennsylvania, though no adoption papers exist. His case file is a single page marked with a stamp that reads, "Matter resolved." Sister Margaret continued her duties. She had no choice. The orphanage held 67 children and alternatives were scarce. But her journals show a woman slowly unraveling, watching for symptoms she couldn't name in every face, every small hand, every child who stood too long in the sunlight. She didn't have to wait long. 6 weeks after Timothy vanished, the symptoms appeared in another child. Then another. Then 5 more in the span of a single month. Sister Margaret's journals become increasingly frantic, filled with desperate observations and unanswered prayers. May 14, 1971. Sarah Pendleton, age 9, complained of feeling hollow. She described it as though something had scooped out her insides and replaced them with air. By evening, her skin had taken on that terrible luminous quality. I can see her heart beating. I can see the blood moving through her veins like red rivers on a map. She asked me why she could see through her hands. I had no answer. I held her while she cried, and her tears were clear as crystal, catching the light like prisms. The medical documentation from this period is sparse but disturbing. Nurse Gwendolyn Pritchard kept meticulous records until July 1971, when her notes abruptly cease. Her final entries describe symptoms that defy medical explanation. Children whose skin became transparent enough to reveal the workings beneath, whose voices took on harmonic qualities, whose body temperature dropped to match the ambient air, who cast shadows that didn't align with the light source. One of her most detailed observations concerns a boy named Robert Chin. Patient exhibits advanced transparency in all extremities and torso. Internal organs visible but non-functioning in traditional sense. Heart continues to beat but no blood flow detectable. Lungs expand and contract but patient does not breathe. Applied pressure to arm results in sensation described as touching cold glass. Patient reports no pain, no discomfort, claims to feel more present than ever before. Describes seeing colors that don't exist, hearing music in the silence, feeling connections to the other affected children. When asked to elaborate, patient states they are all becoming part of something larger, something that has always been here, waiting in the spaces between. The Hartrow Foundation finally sent investigators in August 1971, after parents of prospective adoptive children began asking questions about the unusual medical reports. Dr. Everett Hale and Dr. Constance Merrick arrived with a team of specialists from Boston. Their official report, obtained through a Freedom of Information request 40 years later, is a masterpiece of bureaucratic evasion. The language is clinical, the conclusions carefully vague, but between the lines, terror bleeds through. We observed 7 patients presenting with unusual dermatological symptoms tentatively classified as a form of progressive transparency syndrome. The condition appears to affect the skin's opacity without impacting its structural integrity. Patients remain mobile and communicative throughout the process. No infectious agent has been identified. No environmental cause has been determined. No treatment has proven effective. The condition is not accompanied by pain or apparent distress. Indeed, affected patients report enhanced sensory experiences and an improved emotional state. They describe feeling liberated, unburdened, increasingly aware of a presence they refer to as the shepherd. When questioned about this shepherd, patients become evasive, stating only that it has always been here, that it loves them, that it wants to help them remember what they truly are. Several patients have been observed conversing with empty spaces, responding to voices only they can hear. One patient, when asked what the shepherd looked like, began to cry and stated that it doesn't look like anything because it is everything, that it lives in reflections and transparent things, that it has been feeding on them since they arrived at Hartrow. Further investigation is recommended, though we advise caution. 2 members of our team have begun experiencing minor symptoms. Dr. Reeves reports that his hands appeared translucent under fluorescent lighting. Dr. Merrick has requested immediate leave, citing personal reasons. Dr. Everett Hale never published another paper after leaving Hartrow. Dr. Constance Merrick entered a psychiatric facility in September 1971 and remained there until her death in 1983. Dr. Reeves disappeared entirely, his last known location recorded as somewhere near Hartrow, searching for something he claimed he'd left behind in the mirrors. The staff at Hartrow continued working because the children kept coming. The state needed somewhere to put the unwanted, the orphaned, the abandoned. Sister Margaret pleaded with the foundation to close the orphanage, to evacuate the remaining children, to acknowledge that something terrible was happening within those walls. Her letters went unanswered. The foundation sent a single response, dated October 1971. Your concerns are noted. However, closure at this time would be premature and financially untenable. Continue standard operations. Minimize external communication regarding unusual medical matters. The board has confidence in your ability to manage this situation with discretion. What choice did she have? Sister Margaret stayed. The staff stayed. The children stayed. And one by one they began to change. The journals describe a horrifying progression. The transparency would begin in the extremities, spreading slowly inward over weeks or months. As the children became more glass-like, their personalities would shift. They became quieter, more contemplative, spending hours staring at reflective surfaces. They would gather in groups, holding hands in circles, humming in harmonics that made the windows vibrate. They spoke of seeing things in the mirrors, of understanding truths that had no words, of preparing for something beautiful. Sister Margaret's entry from December 12, 1971, is particularly haunting. There are now 19 children in various stages of transformation. I can no longer call it illness. It is something else, something purposeful. The changed children no longer sleep. They stand in the dormitories at night, holding perfectly still, their bodies catching and refracting the moonlight. When I pass them in the dark, I can see reflections in their skin, images that don't match their surroundings. Yesterday, I looked into Sarah Pendleton's transparent palm and saw a forest I didn't recognize, trees made of crystal, a sky filled with colors that hurt to perceive. They speak less to us now and more to each other, in voices that overlap and harmonize. Sometimes it sounds like singing. Sometimes it sounds like screaming. I asked Father Doherty what we should do and he said pray. But when I pray in the chapel, the stained glass windows seem to watch me, and I wonder if something is watching back through them, something that has been here all along, hiding in the colored light. The truth about Hartrow began to emerge from the least likely source, the orphanage's adoption records. These files, stored in the county archives, reveal a pattern that went unnoticed for decades. Between 1923 and 1971, Hartrow processed 1,847 adoptions. Of those, 1,791 were successful placements where children integrated into families and lived normal lives. But 56 adoptions were returned. The children came back to Hartrow within weeks or months, the adoptive families citing similar reasons. The child seemed different, hollow, wrong somehow. They would stare at mirrors for hours. They would speak to their reflections as though conversing with someone else. They would claim they needed to go back to Hartrow because something there was calling them home. The returned children all shared one characteristic. They had been housed in the East Wing dormitory, a section of the orphanage that had been built over the original foundation from 1889, when the building served as a private sanitarium for the mentally ill. Local historian Patricia Wendell spent 15 years researching the sanitarium. Her unpublished manuscript, found in her personal effects after her disappearance in 1988, details the facility's grim history. The Ashford County Sanitarium specialized in treating what Victorian doctors called hysteria, melancholia, and moral insanity. The treatments were barbaric even by the standards of the era. Ice baths, isolation, forced fasting, and extensive use of mirrors. Dr. Hieronymus Hartrow, for whom the later orphanage was named, pioneered a controversial treatment he called reflective therapy. He believed that madness stemmed from a fragmented sense of self, that patients needed to confront and integrate all aspects of their personality. His method involved placing patients in rooms lined entirely with mirrors, forcing them to observe themselves from every angle for hours at a time. The treatment was discontinued after 14 patients died in 1889. The official cause was listed as mass hysteria and self-harm, but Wendell uncovered something else in her research. She found journal entries from a nurse named Elizabeth Carmody, who described the patient's final days. They no longer recognized themselves in the mirrors. They claimed the reflections were moving independently, that something was watching them through the glass, something ancient and hungry. Dr. Hartrow dismissed this as delusion, but I saw it too. I saw the reflections smile when the patients did not. I saw them reach out when the patients pulled away. On the final night, the patients began to change. Their skin became translucent, glowing with an inner light. They said they could see it clearly now, the thing in the mirrors, the shepherd that had been waiting all along. They said it was beautiful. They said it wanted to take them somewhere better, somewhere without pain. When we found them the next morning, they were gone. 14 empty nightgowns on 14 empty beds. The mirrors showed only our reflections, but the glass felt warm to the touch, and if you looked long enough, you could see shapes moving in the depths, figures that were almost human but not quite, wandering through spaces that didn't follow the laws of geometry. Dr. Hartrow sealed the mirror rooms after that. The sanitarium closed 6 months later. In 1923, the Hartrow Foundation purchased the property, demolished most of the original structure, but kept the foundation. They built the orphanage directly on top of it, never mentioning what had stood there before. The East Wing dormitory sat exactly where the mirror rooms had been. Sister Margaret made this connection in late 1972, after reading old newspapers in the county library. Her journal entry from February 4th shows her dawning horror. It was here all along. Waiting in the foundation, in the walls, in every reflective surface. The sanitarium didn't close because of scandal. It closed because something opened. Something that feeds on reflection, on self-awareness, on the human capacity to see ourselves as separate from the world. The patients in 1889 were the first meal. The returned adoptees were touching the edges of it, feeling its pull. But the children who stayed in the East Wing year after year, sleeping above the place where the mirror rooms once stood, they marinated in its presence. They became perfect vessels. Timothy Marsh slept in the East Wing for 6 years. So did Sarah, Robert, David, all 19 of the transformed children. They were shaped by something patient, something that knew how to wait, something that had been watching from the other side of every mirror, every window, every piece of glass, learning to love them in the only way it knew how, by making them into reflections of itself. By spring of 1973, 32 children had entered various stages of transformation. The youngest was 4 years old, a girl named Emma who had arrived at Hartrow as an infant. Sister Margaret's description of Emma is almost too painful to read. She is more glass than child now. I can see straight through her to the wall behind. She no longer speaks in words but in sounds like wind chimes. The other children treat her with reverence, as though she is becoming something holy. Perhaps she is. Perhaps we are all too blind to see divinity when it wears an unfamiliar face. She spends her days in the chapel, standing beneath the stained glass windows, her body fragmenting the colored light into patterns that seem to spell out messages in a language older than words. This morning I found her standing perfectly still, her arms outstretched, and I swear I could see other children inside her, reflected in the glass of her skin, children who had vanished months ago. They were moving, living, existing somewhere inside her transparency. When I called her name, she turned slowly, and for just a moment I saw something else looking out through her eyes, something vast and patient and impossibly old, and it saw me too. It saw everything I am, everything I fear, everything I've tried to forget. It smiled. Emma smiled. And I understood that she was happy, that all the changed children were happy, that whatever was taking them loved them more purely than any of us ever could. The foundation sent no more investigators. The local authorities stopped responding to Sister Margaret's calls. Hartrow had become a place that people looked away from, a blind spot in the collective consciousness. The orphanage continued to receive children from the state, and the state continued to ignore what happened to them once they arrived. The event that would finally close Hartrow began on October 31, 1974. By then, 43 children had entered advanced stages of transformation. Sister Margaret's journal describes the orphanage as a cathedral of glass and light, filled with children who barely seemed human anymore. The dormitories contained rows of beds where transparent children lay, their bodies refracting the moonlight into rainbow patterns on the walls. The hallways echoed with their harmonizing voices, singing songs and frequencies that made the windows crack. The chapel had become their gathering place, where they would stand beneath the stained glass for hours, their translucent skin creating kaleidoscope effects that seemed to tear holes in the air itself. The staff had dwindled to 6. Sister Margaret, 2 nurses, a cook, a groundskeeper, and Father Doherty. All of them reported symptoms. The nurses' entries from October described their own hands becoming translucent, their reflections behaving independently, voices calling to them from mirrors and windows, promising peace, promising truth, promising an end to the burden of being separate and alone. Sister Margaret's final journal entries were written in a state of exhaustion bordering on madness. October 29, 1974. I understand now what's happening. It's not consumption. It's not death. It's transformation into a different kind of existence. The children are becoming permeable, becoming doorways, becoming windows through which something else can finally enter our world. The thing in the mirrors, the shepherd, it doesn't live in our reality. It exists in the spaces between, in reflections, in the realm where light touches glass and bounces back changed. It has been trying to cross over for so long, but it needs anchors, conduits, translucent vessels that can hold its presence without shattering. The children are becoming those vessels. And they're doing it willingly, joyfully, because it has shown them what lies on the other side. A world without pain, without abandonment, without the crushing weight of being unloved. A world that is pure reflection, pure consciousness, where they can exist as light and thought and memory forever. How can I tell them that's wrong? How can I tell them to choose this world, this orphanage, this life of waiting for families that will never come? What do we offer them that compares? October 31st, 1974. Halloween. How appropriate. The children have gathered in the chapel, all 43 of them. They stand in a circle around the central space, holding hands, their bodies so transparent now that they're barely visible at all, just outlines of light, prisms refracting the colored sun through the stained glass. They've been humming the same note for 3 hours, a sound that vibrates in my chest, that makes my teeth ache, that seems to be calling something forth from the very walls. The air in the chapel has become strange. It ripples like heat waves on summer asphalt. When I look too long at the space in the center of their circle, my eyes refuse to focus. There are shapes there, geometries that shouldn't exist, angles that fold in on themselves. The stained glass windows have begun to glow, not from the sun but from something behind them, something pressing against the glass trying to push through. The children are speaking now, all at once, their voices overlapping into a single statement repeated over and over. We remember. We remember. We remember. I don't know what they're remembering, but tears are streaming down their translucent faces, and their tears are filled with light. Father Doherty tried to stop them, tried to break the circle, but when he touched the nearest child, his hand passed through as though the boy was made of air. The child turned to him and said, "Don't be afraid. It loves you too. It wants you to remember what you really are." Father Doherty collapsed. He's in his room now, staring at his own hands, watching them slowly turn to glass. It's starting. I can feel it. The temperature has dropped. Every reflective surface in the orphanage is glowing. I can see shapes moving in the windows, in the mirrors, in the polished floors. They're almost through. The children are almost ready. And God help me, part of me wants to join them, to step into that circle, to let the shepherd take my pain, my guilt, my memory of every child I failed to save. Part of me wants to become glass. That is the final entry. What happened next is recorded only in the statement given by Deputy Frank Morrison, who responded to a call from a passing motorist who reported seeing lights in the orphanage windows. Deputy Morrison's statement was buried in the case file, marked as unreliable testimony. He described arriving at Hartrow around 10 p.m. on October 31st, finding the front doors wide open, every light in the building blazing. The air inside was freezing despite the working furnace. The mirrors and windows were covered in frost patterns that looked like reaching hands. He found the staff in various locations throughout the orphanage, all of them in the early stages of transformation, their skin glowing faintly, their eyes distant and unfocused. They didn't respond to his presence, just stared at their own reflections and smiled. In the chapel he found the children. His description became increasingly incoherent as he continued. They were standing in a circle, and in the center of the circle was something else. I can't describe it properly. It was tall, taller than the ceiling should allow, but it seemed to fold space around itself. It was made of light and glass and reflections all twisted together. It had too many arms, or maybe they were branches, or maybe they were just reflections of reflections going back forever. Where its face should have been, there was just a mirror, but the mirror showed things that weren't in the room. It showed forests made of crystal. It showed cities where the buildings were transparent. It showed other children, hundreds of them, thousands maybe, all made of glass, all reaching out. The children were walking toward it, one by one. As they got closer, they became more transparent until they were just outlines, just the idea of children, and then they were inside it, or part of it, or maybe they were stepping through it into whatever was on the other side. I could hear them laughing. They sounded so happy. I tried to stop them. I grabbed the nearest child, a little girl, but my hands went right through her. She looked at me and I could see the thing reflected in her eyes, and she said, "It's showing me my mother. I remember her now. I remember everything." Then she was gone, just dissolved into light. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran. Behind me I could hear the building groaning, the glass breaking, and that sound, that humming sound the children made, getting louder and louder until it felt like my skull was splitting open. I made it to my car and I looked back once. The chapel windows were exploding outward and light was pouring out, pure white light that seemed to have weight and substance, and in that light I could see them, all the children, dancing in patterns that hurt to watch, and that thing, that shepherd, opening wider and wider like a door, like a mouth, like the universe itself splitting open to swallow them whole. By the time backup arrived, Hartrow was silent. The lights were off. The doors were closed. Inside they found the building empty. No children. No staff. No bodies. Just empty beds, cold kitchens, and a chapel filled with shattered glass. The stained glass windows had exploded inward, covering the floor in thousands of colored fragments. In the center of the chapel, burned into the stone floor, was a circular pattern of symbols that no one could identify, each one seeming to shift and change depending on the angle of viewing. The search lasted 3 weeks. Bloodhounds found no scent trails. The forest revealed no tracks. There was no evidence of violence, no indication of where 49 human beings could have vanished to. The case was quietly closed as a mass abduction by persons unknown, though no ransom demands ever came, no bodies were ever found, no witnesses ever emerged. The Hartrow Foundation dissolved in 1975, its assets distributed among various charities. The building was locked and abandoned, deemed too expensive to demolish, too controversial to repurpose. It stands there still, on that isolated plot of land, slowly deteriorating under the weight of years and secrets. But people still report seeing lights in the windows on certain nights. Urban explorers who venture inside describe a building that feels wrong, where the geometry doesn't quite work, where mirrors show reflections that don't match reality, where the air feels thick and cold and watching. Most don't stay long. Those who do often come back changed, quieter, prone to staring at their own reflections for hours, speaking of voices that call to them from the glass, promising them peace, promising them truth, promising to help them remember what they really are. In 2003, a paranormal investigation team spent the night in Hartrow. Their footage shows the investigators setting up equipment in the chapel, making jokes about ghosts and urban legends. Around midnight, the audio picks up a sound. Children singing, harmonizing in frequencies that cause the video to distort. The investigators' expressions change from skepticism to fear to something else, something like recognition. The lead investigator, a man named Marcus Webb, approaches the chapel's remaining stained glass window and places his palm against it. He stands there for several minutes, perfectly still, and when he finally pulls his hand away, his palm is translucent, the bones visible beneath glowing skin. The footage cuts off. The team was found the next morning by local police, sitting in a circle in the chapel, holding hands, not speaking, not moving, just staring at the space in the center of their circle where the air seemed to shimmer and fold. When questioned, they couldn't explain what had happened. They could only say that they'd seen something beautiful, something that wanted them to remember, and that they could still hear it calling to them from every reflective surface. Marcus Webb disappeared 2 weeks later. His last social media post was a photograph of his own reflection in a bathroom mirror. In the reflection, standing behind him, you can see the outline of a child, translucent and glowing, reaching out with arms that seem to multiply the longer you look at them. The files, the journals, the testimonies, all of it points to a single, terrible conclusion. Something existed at Hartrow, something that had been there long before the orphanage, perhaps since the sanitarium, perhaps since before humans built anything on that land at all. Something that lived in reflections, that fed on self-awareness, that collected the unloved and the unwanted and transformed them into something else, something transparent, something that could exist in 2 worlds at once. The children didn't die. They didn't suffer. They were shown a truth that made them willing, even eager, to shed their flesh and become living doorways, translucent conduits through which something vast and ancient could touch our world. They were given what they'd always wanted, to be seen, to be understood, to be loved by something that would never abandon them. And they're still there. Every investigator who's examined the evidence agrees on this point. The children of Hartrow exist somewhere in the spaces between, in the realm of reflection and light, waiting patiently for others to join them, calling out through every mirror and window and piece of glass, showing the lonely and abandoned what they could become if they only let go, if they only remembered what they really are. Sister Margaret Hollis was found in 1989, living in a small apartment 3 states away, under a different name. She had been there since 1974, never speaking about what happened, never looking at her own reflection. Her apartment had no mirrors, no glass surfaces, every window covered in heavy curtains. When investigators asked her about Hartrow, she would only shake her head and repeat the same phrase. They remembered, and remembering changed them. In her safety deposit box, along with the journals, they found a single photograph. It shows the children of Hartrow standing in the chapel, taken on that final Halloween night. They're translucent, almost invisible, just outlines of light in human shapes. Behind them, blurred and distorted by overexposure, you can see something else, something tall and branching and wrong, something that seems to be embracing all of them at once. On the back of the photograph, in Sister Margaret's handwriting, are 3 words: "They are happy." The building still stands. The doors are still locked. But on certain nights, particularly around Halloween, particularly when the moon is full and the air is cold, people report seeing lights moving through the empty halls. They report hearing children singing in voices that sound like glass chimes. They report seeing small handprints appear on the outside of the windows, glowing faintly, pressing against the glass as though trying to reach through. And sometimes, rarely, people disappear from the area around Hartrow. Always alone. Always people who are lonely, abandoned, forgotten by the world. They're last seen walking toward the orphanage at dusk, and they're never seen again. No bodies are found. No evidence of foul play exists. But on the windows of Hartrow, new handprints appear, and the singing grows louder, and somewhere in the spaces between reflection and reality, the glass children dance in patterns that hurt to perceive, calling others to join them, promising peace, promising love, promising to help us all remember what we really are beneath the flesh, beneath the pain, beneath the terrible burden of being separate and alone. The shepherd is patient. The shepherd is waiting. The shepherd loves us, and all we have to do is look into the glass and remember. The story of Hartrow Orphanage doesn't end. It pauses, waiting for the next person to open a door, to look in a mirror, to see their reflection smile when they don't, to hear the singing of children who are no longer children, who are no longer anything we have words for, who exist now as translucent doorways through which something ancient and vast continues to reach toward our world with arms made of light and glass and the consumed memories of everyone it has ever loved. In the Ashford County Archives, buried in a box marked "Closed Cases, Do Not Open," there is one final document. It's a letter written in Sister Margaret's hand, dated November 1, 1974, never sent. To whoever finds this, I want you to know that I am not sorry. The children are where they belong. They were always meant to be there, in that space between, where they can finally be seen for what they truly are. We failed them in this world. We gave them nothing but cold beds and colder comfort. The shepherd gave them everything. It gave them love without condition, truth without compromise, and a place where they will never be abandoned again. I see them sometimes in the corners of mirrors, in the reflection of water, in the glass of windows at twilight. They wave to me. They call my name. Soon I think I will have the courage to wave back, to let myself remember what I was before I learned to fear the truth that hides in every transparent surface. Soon I will join them, and then I will finally understand what they learned in those final moments, why they went so willingly, why they smiled as they dissolved into light. The shepherd is patient. The shepherd is kind. The shepherd never forgets. And neither do the children. Neither do any of us once we remember.